All right. Okay. So we're 3 minutes past. We can go ahead and get started. Ram, I can't see your whole last name here.
It's
Chinchani.
Chinchani.
Yeah, I'm missing one character. Cool. Yeah. Cool. Well, then I will go ahead and yield to the first topic here, the app-centric rootfs for build containers. Nisha, is that you?
Yeah.
All right. So take it away.
Okay. So some background on this. Joshua Locke, who is a colleague of mine, who is in the UK, which is why he can't attend, because it's a really bad time for him. Anyway, he and I worked together on trying to use Linux distro tools to make rootfs's for container images that just have the app and its dependencies, either for building your app or running your app. So either build time or runtime images that have just enough to get it to build and run. So this is targeted towards reducing the attack surface in container images and also reducing the size of the image. So we gave a talk at KubeCon, and we got a lot of positive response for it. In the talk, we had several requirements that we were looking at. One of them is the availability and the quality of the software bill of materials for that rootfs that we have built. So what we were looking for is, can we use this build system to build a rootfs that only has the app and its dependencies and will give us a list of packages that we installed and sources for those packages. What was the last one? And not relying on some external infrastructure. So that was kind of like a...
What qualifies as external infrastructure there?
Yeah, that. So that was mostly because typically it seems to me that this is possible for companies that have their own, shall we say, monorepo. So for example, VMware has a list of mirrors that they mirror upstream projects, and they have like a whole build system that will build binaries from those upstream projects or from the mirrors, more likely, from the mirrors rather. Intel had something similar. I don't know how it works with Red Hat.
Red Hat's got a very picky build root system. It doesn't have internet access. Anything that's tagged to be in any of the binaries or the sources of the binaries at the time of the build are preserved when you build that image. So anything that's publicly released, you can go back and see the like hermetically sealed build root that it was built in.
Yeah. For us, the system is mostly internal. So if we have we provide a list of software packages that we are distributing in a certain format, and we provide it to this tool. that will go and look up all the mirrors and find corresponding sources in those mirrors and make tarballs out of them and give it to us. So we call that an open disclosure package, I think. But it seems to me that there's either like some internal mechanism from where, you know, companies get their sources, or there is some picky build system. I mean, and I understand that OpenSUSE's system is also picky. So basically, we wanted to be able to provide, like, you know, an individual developer the ability to create this rootfs and get the sources and the SBOM um, without this reliance on a picky build system, I suppose.
Right. So you want to do Docker certified, but not with Docker.
Yeah.
Got it.
So, I mean, we looked at a bunch of distro tools and we found that they actually do a reasonable job. They don't do it, there's like little nits here and there, but with a little bit of work, we can get it to do the thing. So we managed to build like images for, I mean, the one experiment we had was, let's try to build like an equivalent Golang image, because the Golang image from Docker Hub is pretty big. And we did manage to do that for the most part. Some of the tools are reasonably okay to use and some of them are painful to use, but once you know the steps to do it, it can be done. And then on top of that, you have to do some extra manipulation to get Docker to use it. So anyway, we think that this is actually a viable way for building apps for containers, and we'd like a forum to discuss it some more and maybe like gather some folks who are interested in the same thing. And so Joshua reached out to Chris Anichuk, who CC'd Steve Lasker and Vincent Batts and some other folks. Right. So I guess at this point, I'm trying to figure out whether this forum for discussion should live under CNCF or in OCI. And that's, yeah. And the other thing about it is that it would be nice if the forum can happen in the EU, like in an EU-friendly time zone, at an EU-friendly time, because that's where Joshua is.
Yeah, we've had that same problem here too, with some of the registry conversations and some of them being in Europe. I think there's definitely some focus in it. I think it's in one of those spaces where most people just want to consume it and they don't really care. Like, just tell us what to use. And then there's a number of people that are very focused in that specific space. Like Microsoft has a very similar build system that we were just talking about. And from a service, like we run the ACR tasks and we have the same focus that we're trying to, you know, tighten things up and handle OS from framework patching. So I think you'll find certain people, and Kat here from JFrog or the CodeFresh folks, or there's various, I think you'll find a forum of people that are very interested in improving this. And I was actually at a separate channel was poked about the Docker Slim thing recently. So there seems to be a good set of conversations around, and whether it's CNCF or OCI, I don't know if it matters as much yet, as opposed to get the right people together and see what comes out of it.
Yeah. So we were just wondering where that discussion should happen. So do you think it should happen here? I mean, in a lot of ways, the tools that we're using are not something that cloud native
Yeah.
folks are familiar with. So
The times that I've gotten pulled into conversations like this, and even the amount of the bits of work that I've done on it for the container image and so forth for containers, has frequently involved this reproduciblebuilds.org. They have a conference every so often. There's been one in Berlin last year was in Paris. And it's been kind of a general industry effort piece just to tackle some of these issues. There are people from like Debian that show up there. There's folks from RPM type tooling. The GWIX folks are there, as well as just like academic and otherwise, because to some extent it becomes almost an academic conversation, but you have to have the packagers involved to see how those get adopted, because when it's come up a few times, it ends up being like bolting on efforts around what isn't fixed properly in the underlying packages, and trying to give a best effort at that, at a level above where it's actually broken. So I don't know that really having the conversation at this point to say, is it CNCF or OCI, is really the step there, as much as trying to, as with the work that you've already done and are continuing, trying to see like, where is it fundamentally broken, or almost like what you've done, like breaking down the semantics into like, here's the nature of the things that we expect, and how do we make sure the underlying pieces, whether it's a certain Linux distro or what, or like Ruby packaging tools or Python packaging tools, actually produce something that is consumable by that higher level semantic.
yeah, I mean, this is certainly something that we've talked about in the talk itself. The fact that there is some amount of packaging involved. Nobody likes that. And the other part is that most the tools that we looked at are mostly it's mostly looked at from it's mostly used by embedded folks who are thinking about like hardware enabling more than containers. I mean, when they think about it from the container perspective, they're like, yeah, it's possible. Somebody else can do it. I don't think we want to, look at it. And then you'll have to think about, okay, would you be willing to make a target for containers? And that's where the conversations with the embedded community might get fraught. Joshua definitely has some influence in those communities. So he could possibly go and, talk to folks he knows about whether this is possible or not. I am more skeptical.
Yeah. So I think some of the places that this, if I had to imagine what this would look like as it gets bubbled up, is if there's like a methodology for exporting from or collecting the sources from any given tool. So like say PyPy, generating an SBOM, like the schema for what the SBOM as it would be exported from PyPy would look like, the way that you'd collect the sources from that, and these kind of things. Like what is the schema for aggregating this data so that eventually these tools might be able to export it first class, and it would be not quite a Sisyphus type role, function, but going to these different communities and encouraging it, or otherwise making it easy to export it from those places. But the reproducibility piece of it is, I will venture to say, a almost not solvable problem in common time, because a lot of the different underlying technologies are constantly growing or changing or having different dynamics. That one of the few ways that I can speak on Red Hat's side, one of the few ways that they were actually able to do their build root infrastructure is by saying no to most new technologies that came along. Like, as somebody wanted to package Ruby up, they would just say no, because we can't currently do it with it had to be like C and Python and whatever, like the slow march into incorporating new languages. And new things are always being created faster than incorporating the old ones. So I'm not being a downer in it. I'm just saying that one of the making a predictable way to reproduce it quickly feels like trying to boil the ocean.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, in fact, we've kind of said that we don't really want it to be reproducible. Somewhat repeatable is good enough. So, I mean, I understand like the Debian folks are like gung ho about reproducibility, but I agree with you. It's like really difficult if you don't have like a homogeneous way of defining, your app and its dependencies, and what provides and what it needs and all of that stuff. So I don't think that this is possible, and it might be that I don't even know if a good solution would be to have some kind of translator in the middle, like say. So for example, build root has infrastructure for each of the languages. So it has infrastructure for Golang, for Python, for Ruby, for Rust, in order to convert the apps that you write in this language into packages that build root can use. Geeks also has something called Geeks Pack, which does somewhat the same thing. The trouble with Geeks is that the scheme in which you have to write the packaging definition is all in a language called schema, which is like another thing that people need to learn, and that's going to be
like a Lisp dialect or something.
I don't know schema.
Oh, not
So-
scheme.
So Nisha, what
Or
kind
scheme rather.
Scheme.
Sorry, Steve.
Yeah, no, I was saying, so the conversations you're having here, like we're all interested, and I actually have a little bit more vested interest, but I think this is a great conversation. And as far as like the forum, I working through the SBOM stuff and the security SIG working group that some people that I got pulled into, that is the right places to have this conversation, because those are the right people that are thinking about it and deep into that. Like it's interesting here for you to talk about this, because it kind of helps us and others that are curious about what's going on there and want to kind of, there's this RC thing where accountable, responsible, consulted, informed. I think a lot of us are very want to be informed about it, but I don't know how responsible or even consulted some of this group as a mass is. And my best recommendation, I guess, would be to work in those groups, and we can all help point you to the right people to get involved with it, because those conversations are actively happening. Like the software bill of materials working group specifically talks about reproducible bills. The tough folks are involved in that conversation, like Santiago and Patrick and I just screwed back to the guy's name.
The Entoto folks, yeah.
Yeah, and they're having that deep conversation, and you'll actually be able to engage with them on what you think could be a way to make more progress.
Yeah, so Joshua is also involved in those conversations. So I feel like, yes, they have those conversations, but there is a like a disconnect between the having of the software bill of materials and the generation. So right now with my work in turn, there is, I suppose, like there is a way to generate a software bill of materials after the after the fact, like after building the container image. The problem is that it isn't very good. It isn't a high quality software bill of materials. So it's there, but it's incomplete. And the only way that you can get a complete uh, software bill of materials if you actually know what your app and dependencies are. So I feel like there's that part of the conversation that it seems to me that that's kind of a given, or people assume that it's there, or people assume that it can be generated with the way containers are right now. And I suppose like we're challenging that assumption. Um, so this is why we were wondering if it needs to be like a separate working group or a separate SIG.
And what would be the express goals besides raising awareness? Like, what would be the success outcome?
Oh, the successful outcome of this is to actually have some path forward to making app-centric container builds that makes a container identifiable, repeatable, and recent. So that means that it needs to have, the container needs to be well described. The build system that created it should be able to create the exact same thing, not bit for bit, but equivalent, same thing. And it should be able to create updated images easily, because it should be able to build from source. And we've described this in our talk as well. So that's why we called it SIG build, because it is the outcome of it is basically like a system that should be able to create these components that can be consumed by projects like Kubernetes. So Tim Pepper, who is in SIG release for Kubernetes, is also interested in seeing something like this, because right now Kubernetes is release is kind of a mess. And they are having a hard time accounting for all of the components that is needed for, actually releasing. So there's also interest in, so there's like a SIG security, which is also something that Santiago is leading, that does like supply chain stuff. What I'm trying to say, Steve, is that all of these things are connected. I understand that, but this seems to like have a certain set of goals and its own problems that we felt that we needed to have like a separate forum for it. And I'm totally fine if it's like a sub forum for OCI. It doesn't matter. It's just that I feel like this forum is too vast for in order to include this, because like you said, there's the SBOM conversations that are happening here, the artifact conversations, the transport conversations, and they're you know,
Mhm.
they're all valid and they're all connected, but they don't necessarily address like this one piece.
No, but I think so. What I'm suggesting is it's like create it, and then if it's create something, and if it's valid, people will come. I mean, that's like this is a great group to bring things to, and to even have whatever forum that you've created to be housed under. But I think you're at the incubation point of building that collective forum, and you know there's a couple of people here that would be absolutely, like, if you just set up a meeting and say, hey, we'd like to talk about, this thing, and see who attends. So like this is a great forum to advertise to and see who would attend it, and then set up some meetings, set up a conversation, and see what kind of grouping and collaboration you can get. And I think by being plugged into those other working groups, you'll get more visibility into some of the stuff they're thinking about that you'd want to incorporate and find the right people. I'm not suggesting it necessarily is the place that you build this thing. Like, I don't know if you're actually suggesting of building something or it's just a conversation at this point, because everything you're saying is perfectly valid. I'm just not I think to Vincent's point, I'm not sure what is it you're looking to accomplish here.
Yeah, I mean, Joshua started this basically saying that we'd like to get folks interested in the same topic in a forum. But it sounds to me that the best way forward is to just create one.
Yeah.
Not necessarily under like CNCF or OCI, but just create one.
And so just as a more to the point of not, I don't want to even give the feeling that I'm shirking the conversation. One of the ways that this overlaps with something that I've been interested in and had tried to circulate as a conversation in the OCI forum, that it became clear enough to me that it wasn't going to be arrived at by a consensus of discussion in the OCI, particularly was one slice of what you're talking about here, and that is the ability to provide the source code of what you've built and provide it in equivalent access. So a lot of the binaries that are out there in registries are not easily, you can't get the sources easily. So depending on your interpretation, certain licenses like the GPL v2.1 has this kind of hand wavy equivalent access that I've been told people broadly interpret that if you get the binaries from a registry, then the source should be available on a registry. And so I think I've pointed you to the link of it, but at this point I've just started working on an implementation to do that. And rather than bringing it up in conversations, I've just moved forward with actually vetting this, seeing how well it works in production. And as I'm doing my own exploratory pieces of that, I'm using that informed decision. Then as I see the conversations crop up in places like the artifacts work that Steve is doing now, sitting here thinking of like, oh, well, that basically means to me that this source container thing that I'm building effectively could have its own media type and be a different type of object that's just shoved at a registry. So I'm reusing the distribution spec conversation that's going on. I'm reusing the artifact spec conversation that's going on. Eventually we'll reuse the SBOM, conversation that's going on. But
Yeah.
it's kind of like, I feel like even though it's a use case that is critical path for me, it would be trying to push the ball up the hill to start having the conversation before I've got some kind of like, here's what I've found to actually be working, and here's how it relates to all the different conversations that are going on. And
Yeah.
and then at some point I'll bring it back into the OCI or whatever. It'd be like, this needs improving.
Yeah, so the SBOM work that I'm doing with this group is kind of like that, where I assume that there is an SBOM that I've created for a container image, and I'd like to see like how best the spec can accommodate it. So that involves, you know, should I make a layer? Should I use the artifact? Should I like use both? It and that, yeah, I get that. The part about the rootfs building stuff, and this is why we asked the CNCF first, because we felt like, you know, we can have these conversations here, but we can't have them in depth. So we can say, hey, there's a conversation happening in that forum, go check out the meeting minutes, etc. But we can't have that same conversation in depth over here. But we can definitely have adjacent conversations. So we can say there's this builder, it builds OCI compliant images. It, you know, how do we best allow the community to use it, or does it need work, and all of those things. So
Mm-hmm.
I understand.
Yeah, it's less than straightforward, and I don't have a magic advice on it. Because even as the way I'm trying to produce the production of those images for the time being is a bit like thinking through what tools like BuildKit or Builda or whatever else would need hooks, you know, and like industry best practices of like, if you need this metadata generated for each run step, like when people handed a Docker file, or just, you know, industry practice of like, if you're using Docker files and you're not going to be able to achieve this, you're going to have to do something else entirely. These kind of decisions that are, you know, are arrived at from experience.
So I would like to end on time and give the floor to someone else. But do you recommend that we we ask Chris for a new SIG, or do you recommend that we just like create a meeting and invite people to it?
I think I was when we started to touch on this last week, I was inclined to just have as we march through a call of like, what would need attention first, you know, like almost what we're doing now, but just like, here's the groups that are involved, here's what would be the most productive next steps, and really start chiseling it into like, here, like what you gave us the big end goal, like success criteria. What would be incremental wins or pieces of that along the way? Because currently it's such a big conversation that inviting all those the people that would need to be involved in the whole picture, it either would be painful conversation just because there's so many folks involved, or certain pieces of it would only involve certain parts of the group.
Right.
So how could it be incremental and start breaking it apart of like, I worked with this team and they made sure that anything that they produce, we can push to a registry. Cool, great. Or I worked with, we determined that any build tools that are container build tools that want to produce this kind of outcome should do it in this, you know, advisable patterns, or, you know, I don't know what, and start incrementing through that, because then the community could own fixing that, or somebody could step in and do those incremental pieces. But as a conversation like this is so big, it quickly slows down the productivity of the conversations because there's so many people involved.
Yeah, got it. Okay, let let's see if we can get, let me do a Zoom meeting with you.
Mhm.
Steve, do you want to be included?
I do. I won't. I'm pretty much out for until January 9th or so. So if you'd want to do it between now and the end of the year, invite me if my head's in it. I'll do it. I'm trying to decompress for the end of the year.
Okay. So I'll just do it with, I don't know. What about you, Vincent? I'm open for just doing it after January 9th.
That would
That's
be
fine.
my suggestion. I think you'll find two people, some that just totally geek out and want to play with this kind of stuff over the holidays. And this is actually when ORAS was built last year. And others are just tuning out. So if you find the couple of people that you've been working closely with, I would, and they are interested in doing between now and then, I think you'll get a lot done in a small group, and then keep on bringing the circle wider and wider and building more and more consensus and getting more input. Then I think you'll get more progress.
Okay, that sounds like a plan. I'll send out a meeting invite shortly then. All right, thanks so much.
Thanks. It's a good topic.
Yeah, it ended up talking and not taking notes. So, good stuff. OCI distribution conformance strategy. I'm guessing this is you, Dolitsky, but
yeah, sorry, I should have put my name on there.
So take it away.
Yeah, so I've agreed to try to help out with some of the conformance stuff for distribution. So I'm looking for, I sent an email to the mailing list, and I see Ram is on the phone too. I'm trying to figure out if we can come to some sort of agreements on the best approach for this. I've played around with Quay a little bit today and a little bit with Zot, and it's really I'm just wondering what people's thoughts are on how to go about this. I know there's been conversations around compliance for distribution since like
For a while,
last year.
yeah, and I think that it's so a few of the people that might also have good opinions are not on the call today, but we've had conversations like this for the runtime spec and for image spec, and they were a little funkier to write tooling of. I mean, like you could do certain kinds of conformance testing, but not quite like we could with this HTTP API. And this is where even I'm glad for the work that Dong Su had started a year or so ago. That is part of it's already merged in, and some of it's still sitting in a PR that's gone stale. But of the Quay stuff that you looked at, last I looked at it, it was just going to be like a sliver of it that would be effectively what's the OCI v2 schema 2.
Yeah, so I sat down with Jimmy and went through, it's like a 3,000 line file, and just went through all the different method names that are specific to Quay and ripped them out. So it's pretty much, a lot of them are not specific to Quay. So it would be a good starting place, but I guess like
what's your hesitation on that approach then?
I don't have hesitation. I'm running into Python 2 versus Python 3 issues on my Mac, but besides that,
is there conformance test written in Python 2?
I actually don't know. I just started playing with it today. But yeah, I mean, like in terms of though, no, but in terms of whether it is whatever language it is, right? I put in the email like you know, there is a repo or a project for Kubernetes called Kate's Conformance. And there's a tool called Sonobui or Sonobuy that was a Heptio tool. And they basically, people can come in and open a PR against this repo and say, oh, our Kubernetes distribution works with Kubernetes 1.15. Here's the log from running Sonobui. And I'm thinking about that being sort of a good approach, considering.
Yeah, I like it.
Yeah.
And particularly, so in the past, and this is one of the funny parts about conformance testing, that as technical people, we can start describing some of the pieces of it, but as business people, they start getting upset pretty quickly, because when you're like, red check, red X, this thing's not compliant.
Yeah.
And people get their feelings hurt pretty quick. But yeah, if there's an output that's machine parsable, and it shows like either when they ran it, which version of the conformance test they ran against it, because the conformance test itself might iterate, like rerun again because we've added new conformance pieces. The version of the tool that they ran it against, the version of their application or tool that they ran it with, there, like there's several different markers like that, and then all the machine parsable stuff, so that you can give like, it's conformant, that kind of stuff. A lot of the musts are there, and none of the shouldn'ts, and any of this kind of stuff, like
Sure.
the spectrum of passing. But
yeah, and then I mean, as far as the artifacts stuff go, we can use that repo to test different OCI specs too. So unless we think artifacts is going to eventually become part of distribution anyway.
I'm pretty sure that artifacts will stay its own thing as a reference of, I think they're just like companion pieces. One's how you implement the distribution, and the other is, here's how you handle the things you might see on a distribution, a registry. Okay. But as far as where to put the conformance piece of it, it probably would not be a big deal to make another repo of like distribution conformance or whatever. And the only thing that we get into there is when things start being in, if like say the conformance tests, would the conformance tests themselves live in the distribution spec repo? I would think so. Even if the output of what.
So they're versioned together?
Yeah.
Okay.
And even if there is a a companion repo that shows the matrix of like, this person's tool ran against it and got, a green check mark, that could be a separate repo, because it's not really versioned. It's just a moving marker in time. But I think the tests that are showing conformance should be versioned, or at least, fairly lockstep with the spec itself.
Yeah, putting them in this, I was thinking of a separate repo, but the versioning makes a good point. Is like you're reading this spec and what are the test results. So either you have two repos that keep the same versioning scheme over time, but every time we do a spec update, it'll be good to say, well, if we are approving this spec update, it'd be good to have a test that also has to go in with the PR. So I kind of like that.
Yeah.
On the artifact stuff, I just think of the artifacts as just the distribution spec itself should be open, and artifacts is this big bucket of which an image spec is a derivative of. So having the distribution spec be as generic to support these things is great. And we've talked about refactoring the manifest schemas to be outside of the image spec because they are more generic. And, so yeah, I think putting them there will be good. I think the one, Josh, I have to go back and look at your agenda items. The question, one of the things that came up was, I don't know, actually, I'll just defer to you. I'm not sure what you wanted to cover here. I don't want to derail.
I was just hoping to get some thoughts. And I mean, my basic plan right now is to reuse the Quay stuff and bake it into robot framework, which has a really, really nice HTML report, which will say like, here's the exact request body response and all this. I can show an example of that, but I was just seeing if there's any aversion to any approach that I'm about to be taking, and whether
that sounds pretty much what I expected.
Okay.
And I didn't, even the I didn't expect the repo with people putting in their results, but that's kind of something that we had talked about in the past with like the image spec conformance. It was just the kind of idea of like either upload or run a tool here and get like a one-time token or auth or something that like I ran this thing and it checked that the image I built is actually good to go or something like that. Almost like how ASCII Cinema does it, where you get a tokenized URL and it hands back and it shows like a little green check mark that you ran this version of your thing, this version of the tool at this point in time, and it looked good, smelled good. The same kind of thing could be for registries of like just a way to display it. All those require more infrastructure than just like a GitHub repo, like you said, where they ran the tool, it produced an output.
It's also
I guess it's like good faith that somebody hasn't munged that log.
Yeah, I mean, someone can always come in and PR that you're wrong, Azure is lying or something, right? But like, it's also just too that there's only so many registries right now. Let's say there's hundreds in the future, or the spec goes 1.1 and you want that historical data. And I think a live dashboard down the line would be nice, but like I think step one is getting a process. Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking more about it, and I think we partially discussed this last week, was it's one thing to have the open source registries, like Quay and Harbor, that under CNCF, maybe there's some automation in place that, every time a commit is done, that
Sure.
the verification runs, and those make perfect sense. For things like, JFrog or us or Google, it's like, I struggle a little bit with how honest is not the right word because that sounds judgmental. If I ran the test and, we failed in some place, I don't know how proactive that I would want to be. And I would say that I'm probably more proactive than maybe others would be necessarily, or rather my marketing team might actually try to stop me from being honest and put something up. So I would probably just keep on hacking at it until we were able to go green on that thing, until we got it posted, which means that it might not be put up right away. So I think it's more important right now we get the tests in place that anybody can run and validate it. In fact, a customer of ours should be able to go and get the tests. And the thing that was more important to me was the conversation we had last week was, sorry, I bounced around a little bit. So rather than me posting the results directly and that being the ultimate goal, is if there's a set of tests that people can run, but that they could validate how conformant these various registries are, either for the teams themselves. Like there's a lot of stuff going into the spec.
Yeah,
How do I even know?
So that,
but sorry, it was one more point. It's just the piece that came out of it was, because the distribution spec intentionally leaves certain things open, auth for one. The conversation we had last week was certain registries like Docker Hub require you to create the repo first. The spec doesn't say that. And the create a repo is not a distribution spec API, it's registry specific. So for each, I would say your test framework has to provide that there's an openness that when you're running against ACR, here's the ACR pieces that make this, the automated test possible, as well as Docker Hub and Quay and so forth. And then a customer that wants to evaluate, hey, do I want to use GCR, ACR, or Harbor? They could run those tests themselves and decide.
So the Kate's thing, the README, they're basically required to have a README that's like, here's your setup. So this is how you'd spin up a cluster. This is how you run Sonar Buoy, and then here's the teardown. So yeah, it's exactly that. And the tool that is yet to be created would basically take a registry endpoint and I guess an optional auth token. I guess auth can be completely off. But yeah, whatever's very much not specific to the provider and should work with all the registries.
And then you shouldn't be personally responsible for all the, making sure all the registries, like do a couple of tests with us and then, hey, Steve, what do you need to, I've got this gap. Can you fill in this spot? And, and John can help with the GCR folks. And,
no, yeah. I mean,
so
well, what I'll do is I'll set the repo up and just open issues and CC the people I know. Yeah. Hey, you should create a directory here. You should open a PR here.
Right. So I can run your tests with the ACR derivative of it. And then we have a chance to PR the piece of the scripts that we need added to it to make it work. I think that would be a great phase one.
The only other thing you could add to like that would be to have a default that the clients could go use that was already built and running.
What, like a
default registry?
Pulling down like a Docker registry image or something, or?
Yep, Docker registry image plus the run this script, blah blah blah, run and run
yeah,
something like that. Something that's already
And that makes sense for the ones that like Quay and Harbor that support standalone, but and there are a couple of great ones, but the majority of the registries that are cloud hosted, we don't have standalone. Like you create a standalone ACR by creating an ACR in your subscription.
I just meant for the client side. If it could be to put together the script, that'd be nice. But that would be a follow up, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first version of the repo will definitely have distribution, and then I'll reach out to people from Quay to set up theirs, and then we can have Zot and all of these other open source projects.
Right. Cool.
I like it.
That's all I got. That's all.
Yeah, I definitely like the route of just providing tools as opposed to warranting success.
Yeah, it just isn't gonna scale.
The wall of shame was an interesting idea. The reality is I don't know.
We can still make it. We can still make it based on the GitHub repo, but
yeah,
let's get the repo.
Cool.
I like it. Good stuff. All right. With 5 minutes left, I think that's everything. Feel free to add notes to the HackMD. You've already added a lot of links to what you just talked about so far. So,
we calling it for the year, or are we going to get together next? I know we're getting together tomorrow, but is there a?
I think next week's going to be pretty thin. I think we could easily call it for the year.
Yeah.
In fact, the New Year's Day is Wednesday, so is it realistic people will actually go, or should we just say January 8th is now the next meeting?
I'll send out an email saying January 8th is the next meeting.
Sounds good.
All right, look forward to you folks tomorrow, and thanks for a fun year.
Yep.
And thanks, Josh, for digging into the distribution spec stuff.
Yeah, cool. That was really good.
Bye, y'all.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, see ya.